Well, we'll see how we go today. There's a few technical things. There's a few high wire moments here. We've got video. We've got all sorts of things going on. So who likes going to the movies? Have you ever been to the movies once and walked out and thought, that's $18 I'll never get back? I really shouldn't have done that. You know, that was a movie with no redeeming factors. I went to see a Vin Diesel movie, and that was my feeling. Then I just realised afterwards that's all Vin Diesel movies. So, our text today is John 13, as it is actually through this entire series. So if you just keep your Bible open to John 13, you'll be good. Yeah, all the answers are there. It was just before the Passover festival, and Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. He loved them to the end. So I suppose the Vin Diesel question, the big question is, why are there so many bad movies? How can I have 350 channels and nothing to watch? Why is that the case, right? Well, I'm going to suggest to you a couple of different things, right? Firstly, we live in a glut of plenty, right? And therefore, because we get bored easily, our tastes become jaded, they get blurred. And so when we have too much of anything, which is pretending to be an end in itself, we begin to realise, to see through the veil a bit, don't we? We begin to see that actually there's nothing there. And then we turn it on again, we go, yeah, all right, I might go and water the garden. So that's one, we get bored because we live in a society of constant plenty. And the second thing is, we've actually run out of stories. With so many stories being told, there just aren't that many different human stories. And so everybody's pumping out all this stuff about the same stories, and we see the same story 50 different times, right? In fact, some literary critics say there's actually only three real stories which are ever told. There's a sort of a redemption story, which is like Superman, Batman, every other, sort of thing. They're all redemption stories. You know, there's a sort of, there's a couple of others, but very few of them actually grab people. And most importantly, we've removed the story from love. Because as soon as you treat love as an end in itself, you begin to realise that, well, mainly from the divorce statistics, that an awful lot of people are less in love with each other than they are in the idea of being in love. So if you're in love with being in love, you'll fall out of love with that pretty quickly, because love in itself is not an end until you get to the end, and that's the purpose of this sermon. So there's a sense in which we've lost the beginning of the story in which we all live. And so we don't really understand that the story has an end. It ends in a community of beings in whose life we are invited to share. That song we just sung is straight out of the book of the Revelation, right? And all the saints cast their crowns down. The kings cast their crowns down. And they worship God who is upon the throne. And that's the end of all things. That's the end story. And that's the story, in a sense, we're being invited into. Now, of course, if the producers and movie makers sort of realised that we used to have a story, it's called the Bible. And that Bible, the Bible right from beginning to end, is basically the story of the loss of agape, the loss of God's love, through storge, and the attempt to try and climb back up to that love, that agape love, through storge, which is community and family love, through finding true fellowship, true friendships, which you might call philia, and then the unique experience of being made one with another human being in eros, which is really a forevision of what we are going to experience when we get to heaven, because we will be invited into the family of God and be actually present to him. That's what families are for. They're a forevision of what's going to happen in heaven. But we sort of lost that story, didn't we? Because the world got fragmented and we became sort of entrapped in the logic of the bank balance, and with that went the love of community. So we didn't have a beginning point. People don't love community. When people go to churches these days as a whole, they will love you as long as they're members of that church, or until you do something to them they didn't like. And then, love's over, right? So we've lost storge. We have lost the sense of true friendship, that we will live together, die together, bury each other, have our children grow up together in a way which is really unique. No one does that anymore, right? So we've lost that as well. And if, again, the divorce statistics tell you anything, we've lost eros. We don't understand what it is for two human beings to be, as Jesus said, bound together and made one flesh. We've lost that. There's lots of sex on television, but it's just not very little eros, unless it's eros Ramazzotti, of course, which is another thing altogether. And so therefore we have no middle, we have no beginning, we have no middle, and we've sort of lost vision of the end. And the result of that is we don't have any stories. And so all we do is we just appeal to people's worst, intentions. We try and grab their attention. Now that sense of the loss of story is something which has been going on for quite a long time. In the 1930s, there was a bunch of people who got together in Oxford, and they called themselves the Inklings, and they thought, how do we tell stories in a new age so that people will understand? Talked about Eros and car move. Yeah. Good boy, one flesh. You can have two seats though, it's okay. And they got together and they began to meet in the rooms of C.S. Lewis in Magdalen College in Oxford. And they would get together and they'd write stories and they'd go and read them to each other. And they'd say, that's really good, that's not so good, And of course, a few of those stories have come down to us. The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, for example, is a story which came out of that group by C.S. Lewis. And a whole bunch of people you've never heard of, E.R. Edison and people like that. But there's a story which also came out of that called The Lord of the Rings, which came out of that group, and The Hobbit, which was actually being written before the Inklings got together, because it had been written since Tolkien was at war. But The Hobbit came out of that group of people. And these people knew that little stories have no meaning unless they're connected to a big story world in which those little stories make sense. And so they'd write these stories to each other. And eventually, some of them would actually make it into books. And some of them have made it into films. And the remarkable thing is that in an age when no one seems to be able to make movies that anybody wants to watch anymore, Peter Jackson picked up Lord of the Rings and turned it into a trilogy which became the highest grossing trilogy of films ever made. And all the themes in that film are exactly not the themes in any other film. As we saw when, I think, Amazon bought The Rings of Power. And if you've ever tried to watch even one of those, you realise that what they bought was Appendix A at the end of The Lord of the Rings, and it failed horribly because they didn't buy the story. They didn't understand that there's a story in the midst of all this. It's not just a bunch of characters and facts which you jam onto a screen, right? And that's cost them about $1 billion so far, and they're still counting. Now, the reason that The Rings of Power flopped on Amazon is that Tolkien and Lewis all built their stories around two big realisations. Number one, love is about preserving the good. What you do every day when you get up at home and make lunch for your kids, or say hello to your husband or wife, or pay the mortgage, or this, that, or stuff, you're trying to preserve the space of the good because you love it, and it is the place of your love, and love needs a place. So love is preserving the good, which is the individual in community. Stories are never about individuals, they're about individuals in community. And to do that, there's always a sacrifice. Someone's got to get up and make the sandwiches. Someone's got to pay the mortgage. Someone's got to go to work. Someone's got to make decisions, which is actually not good for them, but it's actually good for someone else. So love always requires a sacrifice, whether that of giving your life for those you love, or joining our little stories of controlled comfort to the big stories of struggle and vision, which are greater than ourselves. The second thing that they agreed on was that love is a light in a darkened world. Most people don't think we actually live in a darkened world, but most people think it's going to get better because we'll get better technology, we're smarter, blah, blah, blah. Certainly smarter than our parents were, because ask any kid, they'll tell you, my parents are really dumb, until they get into their 40s and then they realise they weren't so dumb. But anyway. So love is a light in the darkened world, in which the ancient Christian fathers taught is a world which is dominated by evil. In short, love starts with others and it comes to know itself. But evil only ever knows itself. The difference between love and evil is that true love starts with others, not itself, because evil only ever understands itself. So you see that in the Bible. Every time someone gets selfish and forgets that it's all about God, not about them, stuff goes off the track, right? And in this story in John 13, what's the big story? Judas, who goes off, and because he departs the community of faith and betrays Jesus, he sets in train a whole bunch of things which then become very important. And we'll mention that later on today. So just as in the Bible, love in Tolkien's storytelling is about the context of a huge cosmic battle. It's not all about us, but certainly what happens to us is a reflection of what is happening in that story. And if you've got things going on in your life this morning where things are just not going right, it's because of not what you're doing, but because there's a big story of stuff which is happening, which is affecting your life. Most of the things that happen to us, in fact, we find a little difficult to change because we don't grasp what's the bigger things that are going on. Now, you might not believe me, so let me recall that Tolkien's story in the first volume, The Fellowship of the Ring, and, warning, geek warning, there's a bunch of here. Who has seen Lord of the Ring? Okay, good, well done, Mira. As always, educated, cultured, out there, good on you. So, The Fellowship of the Ring, it starts off with a hobbit. Now, if you don't have to know who hobbits are, but essentially they're portly country gentlemen who don't like to be disturbed very much. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. So that's the beginning of the whole story. The whole story begins with comfort. This home under the hill, which is the name that Frodo takes in Lord of the Rings, Underhill, is the midst of the most normal, relaxed and disconnected community you can imagine. Basically, this community is a country town in Sicily. The tension is created, however, because this particular hobbit, Bilbo Baggins, went on an adventure, and people in the Shire don't go on adventures. They stay home and are comfortable. And while on adventure, seemingly as if by accident, but what we find is that nothing is ever actually by accident. But seemingly by accident, he found a ring. It turned out to be a magic ring, and he stuck it in his pocket. And from that point on, he did not know it, but he was steadily drawn into the greater events of the world. And the whole story, which leads from The Hobbit all the way into The Lord of the Rings, is how we begin to realise that almost no one in the story is what they seem to be. And everything that happens to you, it doesn't actually mean the thing that the people who are experiencing it actually think that it means. They think it means this, it actually means something else. This person looks like that, but they turn out to be that, right? Gandalf, who appears to be a harmless village wizard who makes fireworks for children. That's the opening scene, Gandalf wandering through the Shire in his carriage, and children are running after him saying, Gandalf, where are the fireworks? Everybody thinks that that's who he is, right? And we find out that he's a much larger figure than that. He actually tells Bilbo that all is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. In other words, almost nothing that we engage in the world is how we see it. Think of Jesus. How did people see him? Think also of the way he used to speak to people. He said, you've heard it said that, but I say to you. Almost everything he said was at right angles to what people were living and the way they understood. And that winds all the way through Tolkien's work. All of our relationships are bound to higher, greater things, both wonderful and terrible. Almost everybody and everything is not what it seems to be. And the reader is led from revelation to revelation as the small stories unfold into big stories, and then the bigger ones, and then finally to the big one. And of course it's true to human life. Because most of us spend our lives thinking that nobody understands me. Most people, even if they live together for decades, think that the person sitting next to them really doesn't understand the person that they are. And that's everybody. It's not just individuals. You think you alone were having that experience? It's actually everybody is having that experience. It's called being human. And what the search is for you to find the community in which people understand who you are. And of course, most people find the wrong communities. So the story begins in the Shire, which is a place of community love, or Storge, which is brilliantly captured in Bilbo's speech as he's about to leave the Shire. And at that point, I'll ask my technical assistant to show us the first scene.
My dear Bagginses and Buffins, Toots and Brandybucks, Clubs, Chums, Windblowers, Bulgers, Grey Scarlet, and Proudfoots. Today is my 111th birthday. Alas, 71 years is far too short a time to live among such excellent and admirable hobbits. I don't know half of you half as well as I should like, and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve. I have things to do. I've put this off for far too long. I regret to announce this is the end. I'm going now. I bid you all a very fond farewell. Goodbye.
One doesn't do surprise in the Shire, apparently. All of that's pure Storge. You've been at that party, right? You're where everybody's drinking, everybody knows each other. Yeah. You've got to try to include people, bring people in. You probably run that party, actually, for people in this church. So everybody's at the party. It's like a big Italian wedding, and the best man gets up and says something stupid, and everyone just looks at each other, But it's community, right? And they forgive each other, and the next time they'll do exactly the same thing. Storge is that sort of low-energy love which forgives you because you said something when you might have had one too many. Here, however, Tolkien touches on a core concept about Storge love, the sort of village love which so many people feel when they come to a church like ours. Bilbo jumps up and he says, I don't know half of you half as well as you I would like, and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve. And everybody just looks at each other and goes, what? Despite knowing each other for decades, we still surprise each other with the things that we learn about each other as we grow together through the good and the bad. In fact, we learn from each other in the village because in villages you don't get to choose everyone you're sitting next to, right? Except Car, who chose who he wants to sit next to. So in how we respond to others, we learn more about ourselves. And that's what villages do, and that's what churches do, right? We get to know each other, and you get to know yourself by the way that other people react back to you. After all, as Bilbo says, I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve. An uncomfortable fact about the nature of churches, which is a good thing, because this sort of love is the place that most people start. You deserve more. and it's my fault if I don't love you as much as you deserve. So he's taking blame, but everybody else in the crowd actually thinks he's blaming them. And because we know we deserve more, Storge love is just not sufficient in itself as a place to stay. People who come from small towns recognise this. They love it. They think it's just the best place to be. But they feel there's something more. They need to go somewhere else. They deserve more. And they do. Because Storge love is really about us not being meant to stay just here. Love inevitably drives us to find out what is really happening beyond the current realisation. We need to find out who Gandalf is. We need to find out what is this magic ring. You see Gandalf's face there? He suddenly realises that what he suspected is true. There's something about this ring. And we've got to figure out what this ring is and how it's connected to the greater things which are moving in the world and who that mysterious wanderer is who turns out to be the saviour of the age. Because in a village like ours, you meet remarkable people, but they just don't look remarkable. But then you listen to their lives and you find out that the person sitting next to you is actually a pretty remarkable person. We just don't take the time to do it. We should love more than half of us better than we do. I hope that you have met people like that, people who inspire you here to things you never previously dreamed you would be capable of. People who give of themselves, who are inspiring by the way that they see and seek to encourage others, the way that they see need and they reach out to try and satisfy it. You can't help but like those people. You can't help but love those people in the village. And you wish that they were your friends, because there's something yet to be unveiled about them. What is it that drives a person to do what that person does? That's amazing. How did you get there? Spend 10 minutes talking to Michael sometime about his life story. It is an amazing life story. It's a really scary life story in bits, can I say? But it is amazing. And then you'll understand a lot about the quality of his faith. You can't help but like people like that, because if your heart is moved by beautiful things, you'll wish that they were your friends. And that wish, that desire, that friendship which occurs is what Andrew talked about earlier as philia. This sense of being attached to someone because of this attraction, this love you have for them. And the word is philia. As Jesus says to his disciples, I no longer call you servants because a servant doesn't know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends. Friends are the sort of people who find themselves on a journey with you. They walk through the easy and the hard, and they're there in the midst of joy and sadness. And when you've got a chuck-out day for council, for example, but you're busy and your wife tells you you've got to come to my place and chuck things out because Mark's got a hernia and he can't do anything. So he's not allowed to lift heavy stuff. So Dean turns up at my place yesterday morning, and he didn't know. When he got up in the morning, he didn't think that was what he was going to do. But sure enough, it got done, as it always does, because we're friends. We're on this life path together. Philia is forged by a common need and a common experience. What we have when we're inadequate in ourselves, and believe me, at the moment I feel pretty inadequate about a lot of things, on what one of those who suddenly found himself outside the circle of Storge and in the midst of great things calls this mission, this quest thing. Where are we going? We'll go next.
You have only one choice. The ring must be destroyed.
What are we waiting for?
The ring cannot be destroyed, Gimli, son of Gloin, by any craft that we here possess. The ring was made in the fires of Mount Doom. Only there can it be unmade. It must be taken deep into Mordor and cast back into the fiery chasm from whence it came. One of you must do this.
simply walk into Mordor. Its black gates are guarded by more than just orcs. There is evil there that does not sleep. The Great Eye is ever watchful. It is a barren wasteland, riddled with fire, and ash and dust. The very air you breathe is a poisonous fume. Not with 10,000 men could you do this. It is folly.
Have you heard nothing Lord Elrond has said? The ring must be destroyed.
And I suppose you think you're the one to do it!
And if we fail, what then? What happens when Sauron takes back what is his?
I will be dead before I see the ring in the hands of an elf! So much! No one trusts an elf! Do you not understand?
I will take the ring to Mordor. I do not know the way.
I will help you best, but no ships. As long as it is yours to bear.
By my life or death, I can protect you. I will.
You have my sword.
And you have my bow.
And my axe.
Carry the fate of us all, little one. This is indeed the will of the council. Then Gondor will sit down.
Mr. Frodo's not going anywhere without me.
No, indeed, it is hardly possible to separate you, even when he is summoned to a secret council. You are not.
Wait! We're coming too! Have to send us all tied up in a sack to stuff it.
Anyway, you need people of intelligence on this sort of mission. Quest. Thank you.
Well, that rules you out, then.
9 companions. So be it. You shall be the Fellowship of the Ring.
Right. Where are we going?
A great, almost classic description of a church annual general meeting, really. You know, I suppose you think you're going to be doing that. Oh, well, you know. This church has, over the last 7 years, been a church which has run very much on failure. For those of us we've sort of felt the challenge, we've ever been aware of our inability to preserve the good on our own. And for those of us for whom this is not just a village, but a cause, a vision, there's a sort of fierce attachment to each other because we've been tested. And as much as we know our own weaknesses, we all know each other's strengths. You know, a sword is a wonderful thing, but it's better if you have a bow and an axe. Even when some people have failed along the way, the great story continues, and in the end we have faith that the fellowship that we are, there will be a final victory which is achieved. Interestingly, though, the whole story runs from Bilbo finds himself amidst hundreds of people, then Frodo goes out and then there's 9 of them, and then, as you'll see in the next scene, there are 2, and then finally he's alone, which is a good description of life. The ring is the lust for power over others. And essentially, as that section tells us, the ring cannot be destroyed by any craft that we possess. Only through great danger and amidst many woes will we be able to cast it away. And even then it remains a danger to us until it is cast into the lake of fire, which is a reference to the book of the Revelation, just in case you missed that little reference, that Mordor is hell and the lake of fire is where they're made for the devil and his angels. Until then, our individual battles are always only ever carried by one. And you sort of know this when bad things happen to you, right? I mean, stuff happens to you, and then suddenly you realise that everyone gathers around you and they want to be helpful, but actually you don't really feel they understand. Because in the end, your problems are always your problems. Humans only ever carry their own problems. And we try to help, we try to reach out, but we're restricted by who we are to be able to engage in the life of another at a very profound level. As the characters in Tolkien's story are unveiled to us, we realise that almost all of them also have families, right? And most of their problems in that scene, that with the ring has this effect upon people about, we want to do it, I want to do it, I want to do it by myself, blah, blah, blah. All of that occurs because there's a back history. Gimli is the son of Glóin, who was one of the lords of the dwarves, who was betrayed by Thranduil, who happens to be Legolas's father. And you don't know that story until later on, and then you find out that they're all sort of screwed up. And then Boromir, who's the guy who says, I wouldn't go, you can't walk into Mordor. Even with 10,000 spears, I would not walk into Mordor. Boromir ends up dying in the story. He ends up... no. There are three volumes. It works out in the end. You've just got to get through about 1 million words. Boromir, because Boromir is trapped in the wiles and the problems of his father, who plays upon the affections of his sons and plays them off against each other. And so the love of the family becomes corrupted by the control of the father. And of course, we've never experienced that at all. So these are common stories. And then, as you'll see in the next clip, Aragorn is the heir of Isildur, and he stands before the sword of Isildur, and then asks, is he capable of doing this? Because he carries the same blood as his forebear and all the same weaknesses. And he assumes that therefore that his fate will be the same. So you could go, and so it's stories within stories within stories. But essentially what they then find is that having been led out of the Shire, having gone out into the bigger world where they've discovered a big story, that they're actually in a bigger story still. Because what happens in Rivendell is that one of the characters, who's the guy who eventually becomes the king, he's in love with Elrond's daughter, okay? And we find out that there's this pattern that goes on throughout the 3 volumes, that essentially way back in the First Age there was a love affair between an elf and a human, which was the way that the first enemy was overthrown, and that happened again in the Second Age. And then here we are in the Third Age, and people are presented with pretty much the same thing. And the way that it's achieved, the literary mechanism, so to speak, is through the love between a man and a woman. But that love, which we know of in biblical terms as eros, it comes with serious choices. Number 3.
Why do you fear the past? You are Isildur's heir, not Isildur himself. You are not bound to his fate.
The same blood flows in my veins. Same weakness.
Your time will come. You will face the same evil, and you will defeat it. Guarnechina isikeli. Renichi bethi benen.
You said you'd bind yourself to me, forsaking the immortal life of your people.
And to that I hold. I would rather share one lifetime with you than face all the ages of this world alone. I choose a mortal life.
You cannot give me this.
It is mine to give to whom I will. Like my heart.
And all the girls went, wow. Whereas all the boys, fast forward to the battle. Anyway. That is the only love story in the entire 3 volumes. 1 million words, and that's it. And lots of people read the books and they go, what was he up to? I mean, did he understand anything? He understood. The couple in the First Age were called Beren and Luthien. When Tolkien's wife died, he had the name Luthien put on her grave. And when he died, if you go, and you can visit his grave in Oxford, he had Beren put on his grave. There was this sense that this was not just us story, it was his story. It was their story. And that's true eros, the binding of one another to one another in one flesh, one purpose, love which is self-sacrificial. You said you would bind yourself to me, says Aragorn, forsaking the immortal life of your people. And Arwen responds, and to that I hold. And everyone who here is married and then goes to someone else's wedding, there's blubbering quietly going on about 20 rows back as everybody remembers their own vows. They remember the things that they said. And they turn to each other quietly and say, and to that I hold. But the story, interestingly enough, ends in the failure of all of these loves. In the end, Frodo ends up in Mordor, in the chamber of Mount Doom by himself. And he fails. He tries to take possession of the ring. Faramir, who you don't meet here, but he's in the story, he ends up being rejected by his father, and his search for the love of his father nearly ends up getting killed, and he's only rescued by Eowyn, who actually loves Aragorn, but is frustrated by the fact that Aragorn is going to get hitched to Arwen. But anyway, in other words, it's sort of Mills and Bourne, only with pointy sticks. In the end, what it tells us is that it requires a love beyond ourselves to rescue us. Of oath-breakers coming back from the dead, of eagles coming out of the sky, of Gandalf rising from the dead as the White Horseman. All these biblical metaphors reoccur all the time right through Lord of the Rings. The first 3 loves, family, friends, and spouses, are love getting us on the path, but they don't get us to the end. In the end, something beyond ourselves has to reach for us and show us a love which we ourselves cannot obtain to. And that leads us to the last clip.
Didn't think it would end this way.
End? No, the journey doesn't end here. Death is just another path. One that we all must take. The grey rain curtain of this world rolls back, and all turns to silver glass. And then you see it.
What? Gandalf? See what?
White shores. And beyond, a far green country and of a swift sunrise.
That isn't so bad.
No. No, it isn't.
So what is that story? What's the story within which other stories find their meaning? Well, it's a love story, right? Life is a love story. It's of God so loving the world, reaching out and wanting to draw us to him. And I'm not sort of imposing this on Tolkien, by the way. This is the way he wrote about how he wrote about things. That reference there, that far green country, is a reference to the prodigal son, which is the only place in the Bible where the words "a far country" occur in Luke 15. Because the country into which we go is the country from which is a long way, which is far from the country in which we stand. You see, in the end, the aim is not that we should be loving or do love. Rather, that the aim is that we become love, just as God is love. And that's the inner meaning of the phrase that God works all things to the good for those people who love him, because that's actually the mechanism for everything that happens. You either try it by yourself, it's the work of your hands, or it's the work of his hands. And it can't be both. It has to be one or the other. And the mechanism that God uses is love. That's how he gets us to go places, to get us out of our place of comfort, to get us into the big story, and then to cause us to be motivated enough to actually be able to sacrifice the things we need to sacrifice in order to choose the things that are worth having. Love is the path. Love is the very thing we become when we follow the path to its end. Because what does the rest of the passage say? And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn amongst many brothers and sisters. That's us. And those he predestined, he also called, and those he called, he also justified, and those he justified, he also glorified. That's the pathway. The way you get up that pathway is through love. And those he predestines, he also calls. We're being called to go beyond just being a village. I have things to do, says Bilbo. I have put this off far too long. And maybe you're starting to feel like that maybe this has been far too long. I'm finishing it almost now. I have things to do. I have put this thing off far too long. And to do that, we need a greater love for something which is beyond, something that gets us out of our comfort zone. We can't be pushed to do things. We have to love it enough to pursue it. And those he calls, he also justifies. We need to step into the big story, the great struggle against self, against what Paul in Ephesians 6 calls the rulers, the authorities, the powers of the dark world, and the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. And to do that, you've got to have a greater love. For one doesn't just walk into Mordor. A fellowship which is only about me is not a fellowship. A fellowship is not about any one person, but about what makes us stronger together to serve a greater cause. And those he justifies, he also glorifies. Jesus in John 13, immediately after Judas leaves the room, because he turns to Judas and he says, "Go and do what you are going to do quickly." And Judas jumps up and walks out. And Jesus' very next words are, "Now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will glorify the Son in himself and will glorify him at once." He was about to be glorified. Why? Because Judas had forsaken the love that he had for the other disciples and for Jesus, and had set in train a whole bunch of things which would force the rest of the world to take Jesus to the cross. That's what that word, Jesus says. He says, now it's done. Now we can't turn back. Because now Judas has gone to the authorities, and everything will then follow to where God had intended it to go in the first place, to the point of sacrifice. He's swept away by the power of a wonderful story, the love story which God has for the world. It's a story which makes all of our little loves bigger, and our bigger loves the pathway to becoming one with he who is love. From God's perspective, because of grace, it doesn't matter where we start. It actually doesn't matter what's happening in your particular shire at the moment. Wherever we start is good enough. Even in a little village, in a working class suburb, in a not very distinguished city at the other end of the world, like Sydney. Why is that? Because God is not waiting for us to reach out to him. He has already reached out to us and drawn us into the bigger story. And the story is afoot. The story is happening regardless of whether you move or not. Your choice is only, do I stay home or do I go? And that's the thing about moving from storge to philia, from philia into eros, from eros into the search for agape. Why? Because God is not waiting for us to reach out. Wherever you are, you're in control of how you start. Not because of what you have, but because of what God has done. And I would dare to say that having reached the advanced age of nearly 65, that you can sit around waiting for God to speak to you and to tell you what to do, when in fact he has already told you what to do. He says, love one another as I have loved you. Because by that, everyone will know that you are my disciples. And then everything that the disciples do throughout the rest of the New Testament is responding to the fact that people noticed that they were disciples of Jesus. And then they were forced to do things because they loved one another. Wherever you are, you're in control of how you start. The disciples are more amazed and they turn to each other, who then can be saved? And Jesus looked at them and said, with man this is impossible, but not with God, because all things are possible with God. When Frodo has to make this decision to go into Mordor, he turns to Gandalf and he says, I wish it need not have happened in my time. And Gandalf replies, so do I, and so does everybody who lives to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. Where you are is not for you to decide. The bad things that have happened in your life, you didn't make those decisions quite often. They sort of happened to you because of other things that were happening. But it's actually not the point. Gandalf then says, it's not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. It's what you do next which matters, not what you've done to this point. So now is the time given to us. Jesus says, let us work while the day is upon us, for the night will come. We have things to do. Like Bilbo, we've put this off far too long. Let us follow the way of love until we become love. That's the story. And when we say, where does love lead us? It leads us to become love. Now that's a long way ahead for a lot of people. We think, well, I'll get there when I die because I'll be in the presence of God, etc. You're actually in the presence of God now. In this place. That's what we're doing here, in case we missed that little bit. The Shire was always in the presence of the great story. They just ignored it. All they had to do was step over the boundary and go on an adventure. And then everything changes. Father, I thank you for your goodness to us. I pray for adventures in people's lives. I pray that, Lord, that first that we begin by loving one another so that you teach us to become love as you are love. Father, I just pray that amongst us right now, as people think about their own situations and as they say to themselves, it's impossible. I can't go one step further. I pray you give them strength. I pray they find strength in each other, in the various types of love which we show to one another. And as we move ahead, Father God, we mature in you so that, as you said of your Son, he is glorified, even now in the midst of things that don't seem to be going well. Jesus is glorified amongst us, and we will be glorified through him. In the name of your Son we pray. Amen.